As a kid, I fell in love with the video game studio. You might not know it, it's kind of unknown. A small studio known as Naughty Dog. All jokes aside, Naughty Dog has grown throughout the years, making bigger and more critically acclaimed interactive movies. I mean games. And in the process, they've shown their beautiful realistic animation. And although it is very impressive to see how far we've come in realism, to the point we can mimic human emotion to the frame, today I'm going to talk about the animation in this. Jak 2. Ever heard of it? I won't blame you if you haven't, because despite selling over 2.7 million copies, the Jak and Daxter series died a long time ago. Despite that, Jak 2 was one of the first games I ever played on PS2, and by played I mean fell down the same gap for over 30 minutes straight. And although Jak 2 is known for its huge leap from cartoony to edgy,
I'm gonna kill Praxis!
I want to talk about an aspect that isn't brought up nearly enough. Jak 2 had some of the best animation. Step down, Mario, you ain't got crap on the beautiful Looney Tunes inspired animation Jak 2 has. Some of you might ask, why not Jak 1 instead of Jak 2? As it's the more cartoony one of the two and has basically the same animations. And although that may be true, Jak 2 not only has better graphic fidelity for the time, but a lot of animations were added to assist more combat oriented playstyles. So come with me as I talk about the 3 principles of animation Jak 2 masters in just its movement. Squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is exactly what it sounds like. It's the squashing and stretching of animated objects to exaggerate motion or emphasize impact. It helps you to express movement and weight while still preserving an object's volume, and it lends an animated object an organic flexibility that keeps it from seeming stiff. Take as an example this rubber ball, making it bounce on its own, which it looks fine, but it doesn't give that rubbery feel. But let's add some squash and stretch. As it goes down and hits the floor, let's compress it downward and stretch it outward to preserve its volume. And as it goes up, let's stretch it upward and compress its sides to make it jump a lot more faster. A lot more rubbery, a lot more visually appealing. This is the beauty of squash and stretch. This concept is seen throughout the whole game, especially with Jak's movement. Welcome to the pumping station. We'll be watching most of Jak's moves here. So, let's press a button. Oh shit! Punching, jumping, landing, even walking all have this amount of squash and stretch. Watch how much Jak, and especially Daxter, stretch when Jak punches. While some games might add freeze frames to emphasize hits, Jak 2 goes a more traditional way, by enlarging that fist. Jak goes all the way back, his arms and torso stretching to their maximum as Jak's arm and fist deform into a huge wrecking ball, enlarging the fist and stretching the arm thin, until going to a stop into its final position and back to normal, while Daxter catches up. And although it looks weird playing it frame by frame, played quickly, the extreme exaggeration really sells the animation, acting like smear frames in the span of time. Speaking of which, exaggeration. Exaggeration is the pushing of movement further to add more appeal to an action, pose, or expression. It helps enhance the mood of a scene and emphasize emotion and sell the essence of the visual, making it more convincing. Let's look at our ball again. Although we've already added some squash and stretch and it looks good, let's add some more exaggeration. As it hits the floor, let's squash it a lot more as it's about to pop. And as it goes up, let's make it as skinny as a bullet. And now, look at that. By adding some exaggeration, the ball is a lot more energetic, bouncy, and convincing, really selling that action. And although the punch is a great showcase of this, let's take a look at Jack's hops. As Jack hops up, watch how extremely his body stretches. But not just that, watch how his arms fling out in the air at his apex, really selling the jump as in taking effort. Even as he falls down, his arms fling out until coming to rest. And take a look at how Daxter also stretches as Jack falls down, and Daxter hits the shoulder he is completely ducked until being flung up onto the air, going back to his resting position. Even Jack's walk is a great showcase of exaggeration with him, flinging his arms, making some great silhouettes, really selling that walk and run, with Daxter walking and bopping around, dragging as Jack moves. Speaking of which, drag, follow through, and overlapping action. Follow through and overlapping action, also known as drag, is breaking up movement so not everything is happening at the same time. Instead, certain parts will lead the motion while others will follow. It essentially makes a character in motion or without motion less stiff and more alive. Think for example, characters lose ears, tail, or jaw. This is mostly done by an object's appendages dragging behind the rest of the object, continuing their movement after the body stops. So, like always, look at this ball. Look at it hop. And although sure it's fine, as it has squash and stretch, along with some exaggeration, when it stops, something is off. Let's add some drag to that tail, making it drag a bit as it jumps. And going forward once the ball stops just for a fraction. And by just that, the ball's hops look more convincing and less static, and there was barely any drag. This is the key purpose of Daxter. Really selling every movement Jack does by continuing Jack's movement after he has stopped. Although Jack himself has this principle, his limbs carrying the motion until he comes to a rest, Daxter makes them more appealing. And I think the best example would be Jack's spin. Watch how Daxter grips onto Jack's shoulder and follow his motion, arcing. And even after Jack comes to a stop, Daxter continues to arc until landing on Jack's shoulder. And it doesn't stop there, as Daxter still carries the motion, catching himself, trying not to fall off as he goes forward, swinging his arms. Finally, getting his posture and going back to his pose. And this is emphasized even more in an alternate animation in which Daxter misses the shoulder. So instead, he grabs hold of Jack's hair, stretching him as he carries the momentum, arcing back onto Jack's shoulder. Not only does this sell an animation, making the stopping of an animation less static and adding a lot more impact to it, but it also adds a ton of appeal, making a player enjoy just watch the characters. And as said before, although these frames may look odd in gameplay, these animations look smooth and satisfying, really hitting that cartoony feel. And these principles are littered all over Jak 2, adding a ton of charm into the game. Jumping, hitting, falling, even getting damaged. Even just simple things like idle animations. But as nice as these animations may look, in the end, this is a game. And Jak's animations are king in blending one into each other to make smooth animations. Animated shows or film have an intended story and progression to follow, which allows them to put their best animation into each frame if they really want, allowing for beautiful and exciting visuals. However, games usually have a problem. They have to deal with a stupid player. A video game has to deal with an unknown factor. How and when will the player do certain movements? Players will not like it if they have to wait for an entire animation to play first before their next input is read. So, how can game developers know when to play certain animations? This usually leads to very limited animation, sacrificing visuals for snappy animations, which is always preferable. A game is supposed to be playable. But Jack 2 avoids most of these static stops, making most movements look smooth and wonderful to look at as you play their game. How do they do it? Transitions. Most animations Jack does have in a specific key pose he can use to transition into different moves. Take for example, after doing a dive attack, after Jack hits the ground, he ends in a sort of crouch headstand pose. A player can do lots of moves from this position. They can launch themselves back into the air, let the animation play out, or even just spin. And these crouch frames can help transition into each of those. Let's launch ourselves back into the air. In the air, Jack has this apex frame in which he stays in the air in this pose for a few frames, waiting for any other input. In the air, a player can spin, dive down, or just go back down. And this frame helps the transition into each of those animations. Some might be better than the others, but they all help ease the visual, allowing it to not only be snappy, but visually pleasing. And it's not just the big moves. You can see it in the running. When you stop, instead of Jack coming to a complete stop, Jack goes into a little jog animation, waiting for another input, until finally going back to his default pose. If you stop suddenly, a follow-through frame plays, showing Jack and Daxter react to the momentum before turning. If you're going too fast and do a complete 180 turn, Jack plays a transition frame of him sort of drifting before going back into his run. When you spin and go into a run, this silly animation of Daxter getting plastered in Jack's face plays, allowing for a visual transition. And these animation principles carry into other parts of the game: vehicles, gunplay, and especially hoverboarding. But I just wanted to fuss about Jack 2's animations for a while. And again, although Naughty Dog and a lot of other developers have done amazing work with realistic animations, even getting down to the slight facial emotion movements, I still love and appreciate the amount of thought and charm that went into the animation of these games. So good was their job that even modern cartoony games can't compare to the likes of this 2003 game, which most of the animations were made back in 2001. The only ones I can think of that I've played recently being Crash 4 and Cuphead. But even those end up sacrificing visuals for more snappy movement, which is not bad. These games are a different game style that require more snappy movement, but just making a point that Jack was able to keep most of their visuals and snappy movement. Just damn! Give this franchise a sequel already.
Don't say it. Don't even chuckle. Next time, you turn the valve.